your stress response is related to how your body handles everything. And so the benefits of practicing mindfulness and getting better at tapping into that relaxation response can be really widespread.
This is Task Time Energy, the purpose-filled productivity podcast. I'm your host, Scott Miller. Welcome to the show. Welcome, everyone. Our guest today is Dr. Isabel Roth. Dr. Roth is a research assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Medicine in the program on Integrative Medicine in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. Dr. Roth is currently chair of the Integrative, Complementary, and Traditional Health Practices section of the American Public Health Association. She graduated from the University of Texas Health Science Center School of Public Health with a doctorate in public health. Before that, she earned a Master's of Science degree in physiology, biophysics, and complementary and alternative medicine from Georgetown University. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree from Oberlin College, where she studied dance and neuroscience. And Dr. Roth currently has a Career Development Award from the National Institute of Health titled Scaling Up Integrative Pain Management in Federally Qualified Health Centers. So, Dr. Roth, it is a pleasure to have you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I was interested in having you on the podcast because I'm interested in the research that you've done on mindfulness. For example, you have a recent paper published titled The Feasibility and Acceptability of an Abbreviated 4-Week Mindfulness Program for Chronic Pain Management. For any of our listeners who might not be totally familiar with mindfulness, could you give us like a brief definition or tell us a little bit about what mindfulness actually is?
Sure. Mindfulness is the practice of paying attention on purpose in the present moment. And a lot of the research that I do is about a program called mindfulness-based stress reduction. But that is by no means the only way of practicing mindfulness. So that mindfulness-based stress reduction program that a lot of our research is based off of is an 8-week program that was developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn out of the University of Massachusetts. I believe he started it in the 1970s. And that is one of the most heavily researched programs in the mindfulness space. And so we kind of come back to that program over and over again. And that's what a lot of the research rests on. But mindfulness itself is really a very simple thing. It's about being present in this moment on purpose. And we all do it every day, whether we're aware of it or not.
What would the difference be between mindfulness and meditation?
Well, there are several different kinds of meditation. Mindfulness meditation is a type and style of meditation. There are meditations that involve repeating a phrase over and over again or a mantra, or you might be familiar with meditating with, say, prayer beads or something like that. Mindfulness is more about awareness, becoming familiar with your sensations, your thoughts, your emotions, and practicing non-judgmental awareness of those things. So mindfulness is a subcategory within the larger umbrella of meditation.
And how did you originally get interested in this or become interested in this as a field of study?
Well, I grew up dancing. I did a lot of different kinds of dance throughout my life. And in college, it felt like a really natural choice to become a dance major. And I think that a lot of people who do physical activity in an intensive way, whether it's through sports or dance, have some sense of mindfulness where you're really trying to be present in that moment to be aware of what's going on in your body. Also people in the performing arts too, right? Where you're trying to be aware of this moment and not have your mind wandering, but continuing to say, come back to the breath. If you're doing some kind of high intensity physical activity, we often are doing some sort of practice of coming back to the breath. And so I got really interested in that just through my dance practice. And then I also was interested in the neuroscience side of things. So in high school, my first work experiences were working with children with autism spectrum disorders. And through that experience, I actually was able to interact with scientists from the National Institutes of Health at a pretty young age and learn about some of the neuroscience that was going on, learning about autism. And I just thought their work was really fascinating. And in college, I was starting to think, well, how can I have a career where I bring together my interest in the body and movement and arts, as well as this more scientific interest that I have. And it was a dance mentor of mine who suggested that I do research as my dance senior thesis. And so mindfulness for me was really a bridge between the world of neuroscience and the world of dance.
It's interesting how that physical activity of dance played a role in your interest in this. And I want to circle back to that later and maybe ask a question about that. First of all, I think, because the general overall theme of this podcast is about time management and productivity in the coaching work that I do and in this podcast, my main interest is in helping people be more satisfied with how they use their time, right? So for some people, that might mean getting as much done as possible in a day, and other people, it's going to be something different. I'm curious about any research you're aware of or, evidence that has been found, discoveries that have been made about the role that mindfulness plays in a very practical way in helping people accomplish things that they might want to accomplish.
I'm not as familiar with that. I think in part because a lot of the research that has been done on mindfulness is for specific health conditions. And a lot of that has to do with where the funding is coming from. A lot of the funding in the United States in the last 25 years has come from the National Institutes of Health, which really has a mandate to study health conditions. And so what you see in the published literature is mindfulness for chronic pain, mindfulness for depression, mindfulness for anxiety, or, list some other type of health condition. And so you see less work done around mindfulness for general wellness. And it could just be that I'm not familiar with that literature because I'm so focused on the health sciences side of things. So I'm not super familiar with that. I do think that mindfulness can be helpful with improving self-efficacy, with feeling confident in achieving, say, health-related goals. So in one of the programs that I do most of my work on, Integrative Medical Group Visits, which is an adapted form of mindfulness-based stress reduction that was designed to be implemented into primary care settings, we also talk about setting goals related to your health. And I think that the mindfulness practices that we do as part of that curriculum play nicely off of the goal setting and just general sense of developing confidence in managing your own health that we focus on in that curriculum.
Probably there's a lot of benefit in mindfulness for its own sake, for its own positive impact on our lives. Some of the more practical, I would say, applications of it that I've been familiar with have been, like, for example, I teach prep courses for the LSAT, and I do some mindfulness exercises with my students. In fact, there's a company I'm teaching for right now that has a whole mindfulness curriculum that they teach for people who are preparing for the LSAT because it's such a high stress test. It's written to make you feel this tremendous pressure, like, oh my gosh, I don't have enough time. I'll never be able to do this correctly. And, so mindfulness becomes a really important aspect of that. I'm wondering, in the research that you've seen, what are some of the, like you mentioned, overall confidence, you mentioned a couple of things. I'm wondering what are some of the other maybe practical benefits that you're aware of that are associated with mindfulness?
Sure. Well, I think there's a reason why the program that has been most frequently studied and adapted for different health conditions is called mindfulness-based stress reduction, right? So many health conditions, but also just general challenge in life is related to stress. And stress isn't fundamentally a bad thing, right? Stress helps to save us in stressful situations, right? We have the fight or flight response for a reason, to save us from the hungry lion running after us. The challenge is that we now live in a world where we're encountering less hungry lions, but lots of dings from our cell phones, which are activating that same response in the body, the fight or flight response. And so, or fight, flight, or freeze is really the more accurate way of putting that. And so a lot of people experience chronic stress. And what that does to the body is it sends blood to the periphery of your body. So it gets your arms and your legs ready to run, right? But then it actually is preventing us from doing some of the things that help to restore homeostasis, or kind of a sense of normalcy in the body. So the two nervous systems, right? The sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system play off of each other. This is really kind of how we understand the physiology of what's going on with mindfulness. So that fight or flight response, that's your sympathetic nervous system. And the other side of that is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is working on things like resting and digesting. And we sometimes call that the relaxation response. And so when you're in a state of constant stress, you might not be digesting your food very well because the blood is moving to your arms and legs instead of your stomach to help you digest. So you can see how, in the short term, when you're studying for the LSAT, maybe you just have a stomach ache, and that's not really something worth going to the doctor over. But over time, if you're constantly stressed like that, if you're experiencing that LSAT prep level stress for years, maybe you have irritable bowel syndrome at a certain point, right? And maybe you need to go to see a specialist or something like that. And you can see how that generalizes to so many different chronic conditions. And really, fundamentally, when we peel it back, it's about how we manage stress on a day-to-day basis. And so mindfulness has so many benefits because it's about this really fundamental thing, which is our stress response. And your stress response is related to how your body handles everything. And so the benefits of practicing mindfulness and getting better at tapping into that relaxation response can be really widespread. It can help with pain. It can help with depression. It can help with anxiety. It can help with digestion. It can help you be more mindful of what you're eating, and maybe even help with, hypertension. Lots and lots and lots of chronic conditions can be benefited by this practice because it's really about how your whole nervous system is operating.
One of the things that stood out as you were saying that is, I think, just some of the attitudes that we have towards stress, and not necessarily thinking it's a bad thing. I mean, I imagine you've heard people talking about being in a real high stress job, and it's almost like
they're proud of it.
They're proud of it. Yeah. Sure. Like, oh, it's so, that's just, I like being in a high stress environment, or like that's somehow a sign of accomplishment that people are in that kind of environment. And maybe we don't necessarily realize the downsides of it and the potential physical damage and just the overall harm to our well-being. So it sounds like there are opportunities here to address some of those harms that we're experiencing, and maybe even just think about it in a different way and not think that it's all good because we're in a high pressure environment every day.
Yeah. It's a huge cultural thing. So it's not the kind of thing that we can address in a really simple way, I think. I mean, like the term work hard, play hard, I think also is reflective of this culture where we're high octane, go, go, go all the time, no matter what we're doing. It's in a very high intensity kind of way. And I do think that we often discount the importance of rest and relaxation. I mean, I think it's just part of American culture. We want to commodify everything. So even things like self-care and relaxation, now it's about, how intensely are you going to the spa or relaxing? And really for the body, it's about very simple things like sitting and being quiet and taking a breath, things that really don't cost any money.
Yeah, I'm wondering, what are some examples of just simple mindfulness exercises for people who maybe aren't familiar with that? What would some of those look like?
One of the simplest ones is an awareness of breath meditation. So often mindfulness teachers talk about finding a dignified posture that can look different for different people depending on your body. But maybe it involves rolling your shoulders down and back, opening up your chest a little bit, and just paying attention to your inhales and exhales. Not trying to control the breath, just bringing some awareness to your breath. Maybe you close your eyes, maybe you take a downward gaze in front of you, but just sitting for 5 minutes. I think that's probably one of the simplest ones, is to not try to manipulate the breath in any way, but just to pay attention to the rise and fall of your breath. That doesn't work well for everyone. Some people have a lot of stress attached to the breath, whether it's because you have asthma or you have breathing problems of some other kind, or breath just isn't a calming thing for you. So another thing that people can try is finding some other sort of anchoring point. Maybe it's the sensation of your feet on the floor, or the length in your spine, or even a point on the wall. But finding something to bring your focus to and to kind of continually keep bringing your focus back to that point. That's really what mindfulness is about in a lot of ways. Bringing your focus back over and over again to this moment.
One of the things that I'll often hear teachers say, and I try to incorporate if I'm doing like basic breathing exercises, is, you're trying to focus on your breath and then your mind wanders and people think, oh, I'm doing this wrong. When really, like, that is kind of the point, isn't it? To just notice when your mind is wandering and just bring your attention back to whatever you chose.
Definitely. And I think one of the most challenging things is that non-judgmental awareness. The knee-jerk reaction for so many of us is to judge ourselves for letting our minds wander. But that's the nature of the mind, right? Mindfulness teachers talk about the monkey mind. Like, that's what we have. We have a mind that wanders, and isn't that kind of amazing and beautiful in a lot of ways? All the creative places that our minds go to. But I think developing that muscle of non-judgment to say, oh, my mind went over here, but you know what? Right now I'm focusing on my breath, so I'm going to bring my focus back to the breath. Kind of developing that kind voice in our own head that says, oh, I'm going to bring my focus back to this point right here. That's what feels related to time management for me, right? Is that we all have a tendency to wander. And I think that practice of not judging ourselves for that tendency to wander, or to letting the mind drift or getting distracted by something, but then coming back to the thing that we're purposefully focusing on in that moment. It's just that practice of coming back over and over again. And that's what can help us stay focused on our work or whatever it is that we're trying to do. And I feel like that's also where knowing why we're doing something is important. It can be helpful to be like, I made this choice to focus on this thing. I'm going to keep coming back to it over and over again.
I hear the same thing from other people who have accomplished a lot in their lives. They're not so much into perfectionism as the answer to everything. Like, you're just talking about not being judgmental when you're not judging yourself too harshly when your mind wanders. That's just a normal thing that happens as we're going about our day. And I hear other people say this, that some of what they've found very helpful is maybe acknowledging that not everything we do has to be perfect. And that seems to be very liberating and empowering, and actually what seems to free up a lot of people to be able to just do the things that they want to do in a day, in the way that they want to do them. So it's interesting to hear you say that and how that connects to just similar things I've heard from other people.
I'm a big fan of non-perfection. Yes.
I'm curious about a couple things. One is mindfulness practices, meditation practices date back thousands of years, and there are many thousands of years of tradition of people practicing and studying this. And then we have the modern body of research of clinical researchers and medical researchers who have been studying this in a very modern scientific way. I'm wondering, how often do researchers kind of refer back to or look back to some of this older tradition? Or is there a tendency now are you aware if there's a tendency now for researchers to kind of just say, okay, we're doing this our way now, we're doing this the scientific way, and we've kind of moved beyond maybe these older ways of thinking about meditation?
That was a really complex question. I think there are a couple elements to that. One is paying homage and respect to where these practices come from. And I do think that there is a really strong movement within clinical research right now, especially in the integrative medicine space, to make sure that we are recognizing and paying homage to the cultural roots of the practices that we study, with attention to potential appropriation, because that certainly has happened. And I think especially when it comes to people profiting off of ancient practices, that's where it gets particularly dicey. In terms of health science focused researchers going back to ancient texts, I think part of where you don't see that as much is it's just not as much a part of the research methodology that we use in health science as often. That may not be true for people like medical anthropologists. So I guess I'm speaking from my vantage point as a clinical researcher working in a medical school, trained in community health research, where, we're talking about like collaborating with clinics. I don't do a lot of looking at historical texts in my work. And I know that people who are more trained in the social sciences or humanities might do more of that. And also, all the research that I've done has either been funded by a medical university or the National Institutes of Health. And the kind of work that we do is all kind of based on recent clinical research. So I hope that answers your question.
It does, actually. Yeah. I think it's kind of cool. Like, just for me as a layperson, I'm not a monk. I haven't been studying this all my life. I'm not a researcher. But for me to be able to say, if I'm going to work with a student or a client who is interested in learning more about mindfulness, to say, this is something that's been studied for over 4,000 years. And there's this huge body of modern scientific and medical research supporting some benefits of this. To me, it's very cool that we have both of these, potential sets of resources to draw on.
Yeah, I guess the other thing I'll say is that my work in particular is mostly about creating more access to these types of practices and implementing them within health systems. And there are other folks who do more work on developing interventions, like developing mindfulness programs and really looking at like how and why mindfulness works, and under what circumstances. And I'm not as engaged with those questions myself. So I think part of it is just, where is your lens? Where are you focusing?
Do you find that in the medical community and some of the projects you're working on, that there's a huge amount of interest in integrating mindfulness into different areas? And it's just, how do we keep up with the demand, or do you find that there's still a little bit of uncertainty or reluctance, or, maybe you kind of have to sell it to people a little bit still? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, things have shifted over time. I think there's a lot more interest in mindfulness now than ever before. And you see mindfulness programs in lots of different settings and departments and things like that. The bigger question is, how do you deliver it in clinical settings? Mindfulness is often taught in groups, and our healthcare system is mostly designed to provide individual care. And so that's been a point of tension in terms of figuring out how to deliver mindfulness and integrate it into care. So a lot of what we're studying now is how can we deliver group-based mindfulness and also work with clinics to offer group-based care for the first time. And this isn't group therapy, it's a group medical visit, right? Where we're focused on a particular health condition and there is a medical provider who's part of the visit. So that's actually what most of my research is about, is trying to think about how we bring mindfulness and other health practices, integrative health practices that aren't a pill or a procedure, into clinical care, and also how we start offering things in community, in group medical visit settings. And a lot of that is just procedures, right? Getting used to scheduling multiple patients at the same time and reminding them to come. Little things like that require a new procedure. Or if you're doing telehealth visits, making sure that the system can accommodate multiple people on it and that you can have breakout rooms so that people can have private conversations, right? Just having that capability, that technical capability, is a really important detail. And the same thing goes for in-person spaces. Lots of clinics don't have a group space. So you want to have a group space and then a room where a physician or a medical provider can meet one-on-one with a patient to answer a more private question. So just little things like that. Those are the kinds of things that I'm focused on, and also training providers. Most providers are not getting trained in how to facilitate groups in their medical education. It's a pretty new skill set, and just making sure that medical providers feel comfortable and know how to collaborate, say, with a mindfulness teacher or a yoga teacher or some other co-facilitator who might be coming in. So those are the kinds of questions that I'm asking, is how do we make this care work in clinical settings? What kind of supports do we need to provide for patients? So, if they're coming to the clinic every week for 8 weeks, say, to participate in an in-person group program, do they need transportation vouchers? Or if the program's held via telehealth, how can we make sure that they have a stable internet connection during that time? So yeah, that's actually the nuts and bolts of delivering mindfulness. I'd say people are really, really open to it. It's the nuts and bolts that get in the way. They say, I love mindfulness. Of course I want to do this. I practice it myself. But how do we deliver this in a clinic? Oh, there are going to be all these hiccups, right? Or just starting a new program right now, post-COVID, so much of healthcare is just, everybody's burned out from the last few years. And so, finding people who are excited about championing a new program that's going to require asking something of lots of different people in the whole clinic. You're asking the scheduling staff to learn a new way of scheduling. You're asking the nurses to learn a new procedure. You're asking the medical professionals to learn something new. You're asking your administrator to say yes to something new. It kind of doesn't matter what it is. That's a big ask right now in this post-pandemic environment.
Yeah, it makes sense as you say that. And it seems like something that maybe people wouldn't consider, but people seeing the value of mindfulness and understanding there is value to it. And yet, on a very practical level in our healthcare system, how do we actually deliver this to people? Yeah, I can see as you talk about that, how that would be a challenge.
Yeah, the fact of the matter is, in systems where we're thinking more about keeping people healthy, and maybe this is where I veer into the political, but like in the Veterans Administration, which is a single payer system where there's a financial incentive to keep the veterans who are part of the system healthy. They have adopted this whole health model where they are rolling out mindfulness, yoga, Tai Chi, acupuncture, all sorts of integrative health services are being rolled out at every VA across the country. And it was a big cultural shift for them to adopt this. But part of the reason that they're doing it is because it makes financial sense in that model, right? Where you get paid or you pay less when people need less extreme care. But the rest of us are living in a very fractured healthcare system, which still operates on fee-for-service primarily, where if people need more services, if they need more high-cost healthcare, guess what? The health system makes more money. And so things that are low-cost care that actually keeps people out of the healthcare system because they're healthier, there's not really a financial incentive for people to do that, which is why things like value-based care are so exciting, because it changes the incentive structure so that there's more of a reason, a financial motivation for healthcare systems to adopt some of this evidence-based, low-cost care that actually keeps the population healthy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that under that system where there's a benefit to keeping people out of the hospital, that they would adopt that. It's also really interesting to hear you say that, I think we would all think of government bureaucracy as this very glacial, difficult, like not being the fastest to adopt new methods and new systems. And yet the VA was willing to do that and make that effort. That's really interesting that it happened in that environment. And the reasons that you're describing that make sense.
Well, even before that, it was the military that was most open to, the military, we do whatever works, right? We just want our soldiers to be okay. And so they're the most open, and they were kind of the earliest adopters of things like battlefield acupuncture, where they give acupuncture on the ear to soldiers in the battlefield so that they don't overdose them with opioids accidentally when they're experiencing pain in battle. That's such innovative thinking, but part of it is just the way we think about our patients, right? In the military, we do whatever works. And that's actually not how it works for most of us.
Yeah, interesting lessons to learn there. For our listeners, we have somebody moving furniture in the other room. So if you're picking up that background noise, then, hopefully it's not too bothersome. One other thing you were talking about earlier that I would love to ask you more about, and there's a little bit of a backstory here if you'll indulge me, but then I'd love to hear what you think about this. You mentioned some of your early interest in this came from your experience with dance and movement. And I was thinking of a recent guest, Dr. John Culkin, who was a recent guest on the podcast. So Dr. Culkin he's been a physician for 30 years. He's been involved as a volunteer in international health initiatives. So a lot of his perspectives and his experiences are very grounded in science from his medical background. But he's also a photographer. He just recently published an award-winning book of photography, international award-winning book of photography, that features a lot of photos of Buddhist monks going about their everyday life. So he spent a lot of time around these people, a lot of time around monks. The foreword to his book was written by the Dalai Lama and the Queen Mother of Bhutan. So this is somebody who's had a lot of experience in that world of meditation and mindfulness and a lot of exposure to that. And it's interesting because he says that basically that he is not the kind of person who will sit on top of a mountain and sit quietly and focus on his breath for an hour, because that doesn't work for him. So he swims like every day or at least several times a week. And he says for him, when he's swimming, that is when he feels most mindful, most focused on the present moment, when he's focusing on his movement through the water and the movement of the water over his body. That is his mindfulness practice that works for him. And it reminded me of some of my own experience. I try to practice meditation regularly. I've taught beginners meditation classes. But at the same time, I'm addicted to windsurfing. And windsurfing is kind of a challenging sport because you're basically standing on a surfboard with a sail that's on a universal joint that can turn and flip and flop in every direction. So you're trying to stand on this board and position this sail to propel you across the water. So when I'm getting ready to windsurf, I'll get all my stuff together, I'll get in the water, and I'll usually do like just a short breathing exercise to try to center myself and focus myself. But depending on the day, very often as I sail off, my mind's going in a bunch of different directions. I'm thinking about the conversation I had earlier in the day or the email I'm going to write when I get home. But I find that once I've been on the water for a minute or two, I can't help but focus on what I'm doing in that moment. I just think when I'm trying to be mindful, you completely focus my attention on the present moment and where I am and what is happening in this moment. And I think of what's happening when I'm windsurfing, and it's like all the other thoughts and everything else that's going on in my life just seem to like melt away. It's almost like a muscle relaxing. And I have to focus on what I'm doing in that moment and what the board is doing, what the sail is doing, what the wind is doing, what my body's doing. It's almost like the activity makes me do that and doesn't leave room for me to think about the emails and the conversations. Because if I'm not totally focused on the present moment, I'm just going to fall off and face plant and fall in the water.
Right. I guess I'm just thinking about one thing I love about mindfulness practice is how universally accessible it is. And that's the difference between, say, a mindfulness practice that involves paying attention on purpose versus windsurfing or swimming or dancing, which just may not be physically accessible to all people.
Right.
Right. And I guess I work with a lot of people who qualify for disability insurance because they are living with debilitating physical conditions. And what is so exciting to me about mindfulness and mindful movement even is that it's the kind of practice that is accessible to anybody at any age. And so even if you can't windsurf anymore, you might be able to practice mindfulness. And I think that the one point of tension in mindfulness is that people think you have to sit for an hour on top of a mountaintop, and they're like, I can't do that. Right. That's not it at all, right? It could be that your mindfulness practice is this type of physical activity that you love. But if you can't do that, if that's not accessible to you right now, maybe it's that you play an instrument, or maybe it's that you can lie in your bed, any of those things. But mindfulness practice itself is something that, I can teach my 1-year-old, or that I can practice with my grandmother who has Alzheimer's disease. It really is a universally accessible practice.
That is something that's wonderful about it, is that universally accessible aspect of it, because it is really something that any of us have access to, but that we just haven't all taken the time to learn how to do. It's right there in front of us, right? And the fact that we can practice it just with our own breath or something that simple. You don't need any external apparatus. Yeah, that's so simple. And yet it can be done in so many different ways. I mean, people talk about mindful eating or just different ways of practicing it that can work for different people.
Yeah. I think that's what has felt meaningful for me in doing this kind of work, is that it's really part of the human experience. And so I've also found that in getting to know students or patients, people who are learning mindfulness for the first time, or working with other people who study this stuff, that we get to this level of common humanity pretty quickly, which feels really special.
Yeah. Is there something really interesting that you've learned in your research that maybe we haven't touched on yet?
Well, I guess something we haven't touched on at all has been our work with patients with long COVID. 3 years ago, in 2020, I had just gotten this grant to start a pilot of this integrative group medical visit program for patients with chronic pain, to pilot implementing that at UNC. So we were all geared up to start. The pandemic hit. We pivoted to deliver the program online. We launched that program in the early fall of 2020, and it's been a wonderful program ever since then. And in 2021, our department, physical medicine and rehabilitation, opened a COVID recovery clinic that spring, serving patients with long COVID. And our medical director suggested that we adapt the existing group medical visit program for patients with long COVID. So we did that in the summer of 2021 and have been offering group visits to patients with long COVID since 2021. And we just submitted a grant to greatly expand that work. It's just been fascinating to get to know a lot of people who are suffering with long COVID and see what really feels like a pandemic within a pandemic, this pretty shockingly widespread condition that a lot of people of a lot of different ages are struggling with. It's different than chronic pain in so many ways because it kind of came on so suddenly for so many people and really disrupted their worlds. I don't know. I don't think mindfulness is the only answer there. I think it's part of a pretty complex puzzle. But it's also, I guess, part of just coping with chronic illness. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I've taken away from working on mindfulness-related studies for lots of different populations. We also did a study on mindfulness for caregivers of adults with Alzheimer's and related dementias, specifically rural African American caregivers, and just seeing the benefits of this practice across all these different populations, just people going through something challenging, right? A stressor, essentially, in their lives, and seeing the power of this practice to just help people cope and take each moment as it comes has been really helpful for me to witness that, and then also helpful in my own life as I've encountered different stressors myself.
Is there any way that you have found mindfulness has been helpful for you personally in your life that you'd like to share?
So many ways. I think it's been most helpful recently in having a child and having a toddler. Toddlers, babies in general, are so present in this moment only. And I think also just in being a working parent and having a job that I do think about a lot and that consumes a lot of my brain and my identity, but then also having a new person in my life who I want to be fully present with, I've leaned heavily on my mindfulness practice to keep me in the moment when I'm with her, so that when we're spending time together, I'm really fully present. And that's made it much easier for me to drop her off at daycare in the morning and say goodbye, which is sometimes a hard moment, both for the kid and the parent. But just to know that the time that we're spending together is time that we're both really present together. And I value that in all my close relationships. I think I really value presence. And I try to bring that when I'm in person or on Zoom with whoever it may be.
So I have a question that I always ask people at the end of these episodes, and this could be related to what we've talked about or totally not related at all, but I'd like to ask you the same question. What is your dream right now?
My dream? Well, work-wise, I guess, my dream is to see group integrative care as standard of care in primary care, to have this approach of patients coming together with their providers and working in a collaborative way, introducing mindfulness practice and a focus on health and well-being as sort of the bedrock of clinical care. That's my dream. And I don't think it's unachievable.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is really interesting.
Thank you for having me.
To learn more about Dr. Roth and her work, visit the UNC School of Medicine Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation website, or visit her website, isabelroth.com, and I'll leave links to both of those websites in the show notes. As always, I'd love for you to visit my website, scottmillercoaching.com. You can learn more about the work that I do as a personal and professional development coach. You can also sign up for Task Time Energy, the workshop. These are free 1-hour online time management workshops that I'm offering every month. Before we go, I want to say thank you to my lovely wife, Lauren, and her colleagues at the North Carolina Botanical Garden, who provided some assistance with this episode. If you're a student at the UNC School of Medicine, or you're one of Dr. Roth's colleagues there, and you have not been to the Botanical Garden yet, check it out. It's right down the road from the School of Medicine, just a couple minutes away. And it's a really wonderful place to go for a walk or just sit and enjoy the beautiful collection of flowers and plants that they have there. And if you're anywhere in the Chapel Hill area and you haven't visited the Botanical Garden yet, I recommend going there sometime. You can find out more at ncbg.unc.edu, and I will include that link in the show notes as well. If you're wondering what my dog Bug is doing, she is playing with her new best friend, Maple. Maple is the new dog that we just adopted this past weekend. Remember to like or subscribe or follow or click whatever button is on your podcast player so you can come back and join us again. Until then, thanks for listening. Take care.